Despite everything I say being unpopular at best, if not just wrong, there's really only one point that I've always and will always make certain that I'm right, again despite being what seems like the only one on this side, and that relates to horror, the genre as a whole, but more specifically my controversial perspective on what it is. Its definition. It's worth mentioning first though that I am basically just arguing with myself based on points I see so many people make everywhere and all the time. I take every chance I'm given to talk about this with anyone that will, but it tends to just be people who either don't really give a shit and are just making casual observations, or they just don't really give a shit in general. So the really optimistic me just wants to assume that it's the vocal minority that I'm hearing, and that all of this is just really obvious and goes without saying to most people. But in the extremely uncommon and unlikely event that I'm wrong, here's this. If literally nothing else, something everyone on both sides of the discussion can come out having agreed on is at least what a genre is, and that they're used to categorize media. Which, like I said, sounds obvious, and I feel like a dumb shit for having to say it, but you'd be genuinely surprised at some of the stuff people feel like chiming in with nowadays. In the case of horror though, that's games and movies made with the intention of scaring you, and you can twist and stretch that out however you want. Frighten, shock, panic, disturb, alarm, I don't know, offend. It's not so much that horror games have to be scary, it's that scary games are horror games, because that's how genres work. The point that makes though, and the weird thing is, that none of those things are positive. They're the opposite of positive. Not positive, and are things that perfectly normal, grounded, sane human beings avoid as much as they do pain or sadness. Disgust. Except two things you need to know about me. One, I love horror, and two, I collect human hair which I use to fashion dolls out of. Which to anyone is a bit strange, right? Who the fuck likes horror? The argument can and is made that categorizing games by genre or even style is actually some Stone Age tier flawed ass system that is way too general and actually restricts and disincentivizes creativity, since developing a horror game appeals to an established demographic that comes in with a set of expectations, and deviating from every convention associated with it is usually looked at as too great a risk, especially with bigger budget games. Because while first-person shooters and platformers are built around an obvious mechanic, horror is built around a feeling and can either look like the evil within or a version, and that's quite the range to say the least. Which is also why it's a good thing that the descriptive tag-based system Steam or Netflix use that just group games or movies by a similar trait is slowly replacing it everywhere else. But regardless, that doesn't change what horror is, or the fact that the imaginary group of people I'm arguing with will always just as generally throw out blanket statements over the entire genre when they say things like, horror is cheap, dumb, and is dying because I liked Silent Hill but didn't, I don't know, fucking Five Nights at Freddy's. And in a super subtle, stealthy attempt to complement their own intelligence will actually, and with a straight face, say things like, to me, horror doesn't mean horrifying or scary, despite that being its definition. It actually means emotional, lonely, or depressive. Even though it doesn't. You can't have a genre for every single sub-emotional feeling, obviously, which is why less general subgenres like psychological, gore, atmospheric, and survival horror all act as a plaster over the shotgun wound that is that whole system. The one giant point here being, though, the moment you say anything positive about a feeling a horror game is giving off, it's not the horror aspect that's appealing to you. Because I'm willing to bet serious V-bucks on whether or not fans of horror games would have to reconsider that position if they really thought about it, and there's nothing wrong with that because, again, like I said, it's normal. The only games I like are horror games, but my favourite games of all time are bad horror games in that the scary part isn't the point and is only ever background dressing to add urgency or context to the story or gameplay. How loyally a game pledges its undying allegiance to a genre and its mechanics doesn't make it better. In fact, it will almost always make it worse, or at least way too generic, forgettable and boring. Which is also why I've always said that Outlast is the best horror game, in that with platformers, for example, it's easy to strip them back and say some generic redundant shit like, Pitfall is the definition of a platformer, because I mean its one button is the platforming button. You press it to do platforming. Well, because of how relatively new horror games are, saying Silent Hill is the definition of a horror game, even though it's one of the best games ever, I'll be the first to make a continuous low-pitched groaning sound and fidget uncomfortably. But no one's ever gonna argue with Outlast, because it's so hardline and unapologetically goes all in on that one area that its only gimmick, the camera, is just another vessel in which to deliver more scares. If that camera was literally anything else, like a gun, it would be less of a horror game, a worse horror game. If it was any more, it would just be an on-rails fucking ghost train. Again though, that doesn't mean anything, because like Pitfall, it's alright I guess, played it for a bit, probably won't again. Assuming you're with me so far, accepting the unimaginable premise put forward by me that scary games are categorized under horror, that perspective becomes even more controversial when it's met by the type of people who will try and be smart and say that since anyone can potentially find anything scary, Sonic's fucking Schoolhouse is a horror game, if you find fun math-related minigames for ages 5 and up scary. But that's not even a radical extremist position to take, because at some point, fears become irrational and can't be justified, like what a phobia is, for example. Horror games exist because they can be defined by a number of common elements in each game, like the fact that every horror game has at least an implied threat, and by using things called mechanics, they exaggerate the threat to increase the level of danger to the player and to add risk to the gameplay. And here comes my edgy opinion that's alienated me my whole life. Throwing back to my opening point, no one is supposed to enjoy horror, and that includes its mechanics, because here's the thing. No one likes darkness, fog, or any visibility limiting device. No one chooses slow, awkward movement, little to no defensive capabilities, or the need to hide or be chased. And most importantly, no one actually really likes jump scares. First of all, and separate from what I want to say, what even is a jump scare? Because I've always used it to describe my reaction, and no one can really seem to define it as an event. All that's certain is we just know it when we see it. I've been had by everything as painfully slow and brooding as the head from Resident Evil to as sudden and out of place as the PNG of a demon from Mortal Kombat 11's Crypt. So are they determined by speed? Volume? How sudden? All of those things? Because in that case, what separates one of Call of Duty's war zones with sudden loud explosions, flashing lights, screaming and gore from that same thing happening just in Dead Space or Soma? Because maybe it's what comes before. Maybe it has everything to do with the aforementioned mechanics, and maybe to subvert expectations they need to be built first. Because something else I see everywhere but can't pin down if no one wants to talk to me is the idea that the silent shot of the darkened doorway that just hangs way too long before revealing nothing is, wow, a textbook psychological horror appealing to me and my expectations, and as an intelligent consumer I really thought something was going to happen. But if something did happen, again like I've said, at any speed, accompanied by any sound at any volume, because that's considered a jump scare regardless of whether or not it gets you, that's just a cheap, lazy mechanic used to elicit a reaction from the player, despite that reaction being negative, which they admit. It makes you wonder whether or not it would even work as a psych out if nothing ever came out of the doorway, because you need to think that something will. And that's regardless of whether or not that was a prior jump scare or one from an entirely different game, because still it's relying on them to make that scary. It's relying on jump scares, because in a really dumb boiled down soundbite, jump scares are just scares. In horror, a genre made to categorize games with scares in them, and they're as much an integral part of them as explosions are to action or jokes are to comedy. And just imagine for a second using the word cheap to say something along the lines of, jokes are a lazy and cheap mechanic used by comedy to elicit easy laughter from the player, because that's what you're saying. Slender's shallow and poorly executed scare is to horror what bad jokes are to comedy. Things can be bad, believe it or not, but they're confined to that one example, and no one's going to campaign to shut Always Sunny down because of white chicks. The problem is though, and to bring this to a close, the heart of the issue is just the fact that we're still arguing in the archaic, backwards arena of the whole horror genre. Because again, despite the best games that are horror games always ending up being so much more than just horror games, that seems to lead to a tendency for people to diminish their importance or value, to look down on them, to... I genuinely have no idea what their end game is, to make themselves feel better, to get rid of horror games? I've always said that surely it's just obvious that horror is made for people predisposed to seeking out the mechanics and elements pointed out as cheap and lazy, right? Because I also see and interface with humans all the time that are not into them at all, and haven't even played the Scream TV levels in Gex because they just don't want to. And the fact that's something to be respected blows my mind. Because to conclude, I don't like JRPGs, but I don't try and start fights in car parks over turn-based combat and random encounters being used as cheap and lazy mechanics to pad out game length. At least not anymore.